Have you ever bought an entire 2000 point army of 40k and regretted it? Tried to go for a paint scheme that's so hard that you could never replicate it across an army? Or built very heavily around one unit and then get utterly ruined by an addition change? Let's talk about some common pitfalls when collecting Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where I thought in this video we'd talk through some common potential mistakes that newer players might make when getting into the game of 40k for the first time, and cover a few basic potential errors to be aware of as you start your 40k collection. For this video I asked you guys for a few extra suggestions in a channel post, combined it with a bunch of my own thoughts, to better cover a whole bunch of different areas that might be worth talking about for people who are jumping into the game. Obviously, with that being said, it does kind of depend a bit on how you're enjoying your hobby. People collect, paint and play in very different ways which work for them. You might not necessarily want to game at all and just want a few Space Marines to look good on the shelf. Be massively into the lore and custom conversions for your army for making a cool casual gaming force. Or your first enjoyment might be the gaming side and you want to make a robust tournament ready force to see you in from edition to edition. Lots of people like all three of those and any other things in between or different motivations, and it does mean that certain things that you might call mistakes just might not really apply to one collector or another, so I bear that in mind. Jumping into it though, and perhaps some of the most often given advice in Warhammer 40k is to avoid buying too much too fast. Unless you're very experienced with collecting 40k armies and you know pretty much what you're doing already, it is perhaps one of the easiest shortcuts to spending a lot of money and not really getting exactly what value you wanted out of it. I think it's perhaps a fairly common story that people jump into the game, see a whole load of things and want to get a big army together straight away, buy a huge pile of kits and boxes from Games Workshop, stuff that it might take absolutely forever to assemble, paint and get on the table, and they might have just bought themselves enough hobby work to do for basically an entire year in one go, where it's just kind of unnecessary. There's a whole load of good reasons to just collect slow and steady, perhaps in particular just getting a feel for your faction, whether you actually enjoy the army and you really think that you are going to want to collect up to a massive 2000 point army of them, whether it's the way that they play on the tabletop or the way that the miniatures look and feel as you're actually getting them together and getting paint on them, which might not be the same sort of experience as what they just look like on the box art. Having an enormous army of models that are all just grey plastic is also a little bit disheartening to actually getting them done and getting the army finished. Plus, at the very start, when you're starting to get an army together, you might not 100% know which units or choices from the faction that you really want in the force, either in terms of gameplay or looks and lore. So trying to plan your purchases perfectly right from the start might just lead to a whole load of things that you bought and then kind of regret and wish that you got something else. Admittedly, Warhammer boxes can tend to resell at least okay for the money, though you are likely to lose some money if you do wind up buying things that you then go on to resell. But in general, the typical advice tends to be to go slow and steady, buy units, paint it up, play a game with it. I'm sure Games Workshop will still have the rest of them waiting there in the shop for you later. For another common hobbying thing that I've seen a lot of people make the mistake of is gluing in flying bases to your models, and this one's certainly something that I was guilty of myself for the first couple of land speeders that I had in my collection a long time ago. In general, Games Workshop are perhaps trying to design a few more miniatures that don't have these slender, clear plastic rods, but there's still quite a lot of miniatures that do, various grav tanks and speeders, jump infantry such as Inceptors, and some jet bikes like the Virtus Praetors. It's perhaps not entirely obvious that they shouldn't be glued in until you've witnessed firsthand the pain of them snapping off, as if you glue some slender brittle plastic onto the model then it becomes very top heavy and the slightest pressure when it's stored is going to make them break very easily. I feel like GW designs at least most of these so you can lift them on and off fairly easily, though I'd say that some of them work a bit better than others. The rod and ball type bases are perhaps some of the worst ones though, like the Inceptors have. I've seen a fair few of those where they just want to drop out quite easily. Depending on the model, they might just need a little bit of fixing up. You can either potentially drill and pin the bottom of the miniature, or potentially swap out the top of the base for some paired magnets. They do super glue quite easily to the flight stands, and I feel like if you choose the appropriate size ones, that's one of the better fixes. I'll be interested to hear how you guys solve the problems though, if it's necessary for you. Next up, and another potential pitfall when collecting and choosing miniatures, could be flitting between products a bit too much, sometimes called being a hobby butterfly, particularly if the eventual aim for your collection is that you want to be able to play full games with the army, say 1000 points or 2000 points. I think when people first get into Warhammer, they can be a little bit undecided as to which army they really want to choose and develop into a full force. And to an extent, I think a bit of experimentation isn't exactly the bad thing. If you are going to be sinking loads and loads of hours and time investment into an army, you want to try and make sure it's the right one. On the other hand though, if you just keep up picking on random boxes of different armies and just purely get the things that you look cool with no real thought as to how they fit into the greater plan, you probably are going to wind up with a whole bunch of really quite small collections and potentially unfinished projects, which if you're actually wanting to play bigger games with any one of those armies, you might not be able to. Overall, I think being able to have at least some degree of focus and sticking to and enjoying an army can be really quite rewarding. Even if it does take a little bit more planning and focused effort, you perhaps get a better end result. Besides things like flying bases, there are a bunch of other Warhammer 40k painting and model assembly mistakes that you might make. Perhaps the most classic and oft repeated one is thin your paints, beautifully modelled by this poor ultramarine on the top right here. Loads of good painting tutorials exist online these days, but I feel like quite a lot of hobbyist journeys still start with people just applying some paint straight from the pot, kind of leading it to be all pretty thick and obscuring some of the details of the miniature, where usually most of them need at least a little bit of watering down to make them flow a bit better. Otherwise, for mini assembling, be careful to remove mould lines, things like this one on the bottom right here. Little ridges of plastic that come out in the moulding process that can either be removed with a fancy mould line remover or just something like a craft knife. And finally, when actually getting paint onto your miniatures, it does make sense to prime the models, something that when I was younger I certainly didn't understand the value of. Even if you want to paint your miniatures a different colour to the one that comes out of the primer, it's still worth doing as it basically creates a bit of an adhesive layer between the paint and the actual plastic, as acrylic paint from the pot can chip off even plastic miniatures really quite easily, and if you want you can make them even more hard wearing by a layer of varnish. Might not be something that feels very important at the time, but certainly can be something that you'll thank yourself for after a year or two's worth of gaming and you don't have a case full of chipped miniatures. With collecting miniatures, I think it's always worth bearing in mind the other sources to buy Warhammer and 40k models. Something I do repeat a fair bit on the channel, but also something that's well worth making sure that people are aware of, so you don't just make the mistake of thinking that literal Games Workshop shops are the only way that you can get your hands on hobby things, and plenty of other options exist that in the right circumstances could save you an awful lot of money. I think eBay is really quite good if it's used right. You do need to make sure there's quite clear photos of what you're buying and make sure it is fit for purpose. And you also need a bit of impulse control as well, so you don't just go bidding on literally every interesting lot for your faction and potentially wind up with too much stuff. Can definitely be a massive way to save some value though. You can paint strips and miniatures or just paint over depending on the quality of the models that you've got, and can be a good way to save a big percentage on an army overall, perhaps particularly for models that you don't quite care as much about the massive fine detail of. I found that eBay models make particularly good fillers for hoardy type units, perhaps loads of guardsmen or orcs for example. Otherwise, there's loads of third-party gaming stores out there that sell the exact same boxes that Games Workshop do, possibly things local to yourselves, but generally just online you can often find some good deals. Just Google discount Warhammer in your country and see what comes up. I do have a few channel affiliates linked down in the video description: Element Games in the UK, Noble Knight Games in the USA, and Gap Games in Australia. All of those have fairly good savings, usually around about 10 to 20% depending on the individual one. If you want new Games Workshop kits, then these can definitely give you some big savings. It's quite nice for local gaming stores as well, as it lets you support your local place where you actually play games. 3D printing is very much on the rise, a bit of a hobby in itself. I think it's perhaps not for everyone with the place that you need to store the printer plus the time to learn the skill. But for those that do take the plunge and get used to 3D printing regularly, it can be a very powerful source for lookalike proxies for 40k miniatures or weapons or aesthetic parts. Really quite a cool thing to be able to do if you make the investment. And there are also third-party manufacturers, often sculpting things in resin. Again, plenty of stuff that's suitable for near proxies for 40k things. Getting back to painting miniatures, and when you're establishing a colour scheme for a faction, I think it can both be a mistake to either set your own standards too high and try something that's just unrealistic to replicate over the course of an army. But on the flip side, it could also be a mistake to set your own bar too low, wind up just doing a very rushed paint job on a whole load of miniatures, and then you can't stand the sight of them on the tabletop as you know that you could have done so much better. I think for newer hobbyists, it's often going to be more worth it to just focus on simple and effective colour schemes, perhaps making some good use of dry brushes, contrasts, or washes, though admittedly they'll work a bit better for different factions compared with others. On the side of trying to do things too well, I feel like most new hobbyists probably aren't going to be able to paint things quite up to the standard of Games Workshop's box art, and even if so, the heavy metal type paint schemes that Games Workshop tends to employ, with a lot of hard edge highlighting, perhaps are some of the more labour intensive ones out there in Warhammer 40k, compared with what you might achieve with things like washes and dry brushes. I think it's definitely worth experimenting a little bit with a few initial models to try and work out a paint scheme that you quite like and also will be able to replicate somewhat quickly. And it's probably not worth stressing too much early on about the appearance of literally every single detail of every miniature. I think there's definitely an element of perfection being the enemy of good with getting a force on the tabletop. Often some fine details might matter a little bit less just compared with the entire general impression of the force and how it looks from a distance, so I bear both in mind. I'd also probably bear in mind that when starting out, I'd go for cheaper brushes to start with, things from hobby shops as opposed to very fancy sable expensive ones from some of the most premium painting brands or Games Workshop themselves. Lots of very good painters stay using cheap brushes the entire time. They might last a bit less long but can still do the job fairly well in the meantime and probably saves money overall. And then you can progress to higher end tools if you really need them, but I feel like when you're first getting started they're just not really all that necessary. Perhaps tying into a bit with things like buying too much and being a bit of a hobby butterfly, having a huge pile of unbuilt miniatures is something that a lot of 40k collectors out there are guilty of, certainly myself included, unfortunately. Endearingly known as the pile of shame, all the miniatures that you've bought so far but haven't actually got around to sticking together and getting some paint on. Until you have got round to dealing with a fair bit of the backlog, you probably shouldn't go out and buy a whole bunch of new shinies from Games Workshop, even if they have released something cool. I feel like getting a hobby backlog like this is perhaps surprisingly easily done. In 40k, it might be just easy to have overambitious expectations, thinking you'll be able to get a whole bunch of projects finished really quite quickly as you're very motivated to do so. But then when it comes round to it, you don't actually have the time available to get that on the table, or if you're very tired after doing other things in the day, you might just not have the motivation to get through the backlog quite as much, and it's far easier to buy things as opposed to actually do the hobby work to paint them up. Games Workshop kind of don't help too much with that, with promoting their new shiny things for each faction when they come out. Plus, in particular, those limited discount sets that they do, they can certainly tempt people into them, and they can be genuinely quite good deals at the time, but could certainly add to the problem if you've already got more of a backlog than you can really handle right now. In general, if you can try and live life without a pile of unbuilt models, it probably is for the best. It's potentially really quite expensive and a bit wasteful in the long run. You might just wind up never getting around to some things for years on end and then reselling them at a loss. Letting things get out of control can make things a little bit less focused to which project you're working on and getting finished. And certainly for more established hobbyists who might have a big backlog of this sort of stuff, space and storage can genuinely be a factor. I am saying all this while looking around very guiltily at my room at the moment and the many unfinished projects that I've got on the go. In reality, I feel like having a little bit of different projects to work on at the same time isn't the worst. It's perhaps when it just starts to get out of control and you've got lots of things that you haven't touched in a very long time. That's when the problem really starts to develop, and probably just need to be a bit more disciplined with buying new things or focusing down each project until it's done without jumping around too much. For a potential mistake in collecting for gaming for Warhammer 40k, I've certainly seen a fair few people who have maybe built around one very niche strategy or unit, something that most people outside of their army might have been able to tell them that is very likely to get changed from one edition to another. If you've got a 40k faction that's built very heavily around one quirk of the rules, when Games Workshop inevitably either cycles the points or updates your faction's codex, you might just be left with an army of models that really doesn't work to any level whatsoever, and in some cases might be entirely unplayable. I'd say it might be perhaps a bit more obvious on certain units. Say, for example, if you went very big on just one unit type in your army and don't really have anything else as redundancy to back it up, if that unit type is less favoured either in the next edition of the game or the next codex, you might suddenly have an army that's very ineffective on the tabletop and you're going to struggle to make work. Perhaps one example out of this could be Invicta Tactical Warsuits. When they came out, it was all the rage in tournament lists to have a trio of these infiltrating in the midfield and then hitting the opponent very hard turn 1. But for someone who's newly starting Space Marines without much of a collection yet, immediately going down and picking up 3 of these would probably not be a good idea. Sure, it might work out for the next few months or so until another balance pass or something, but then if Games Workshop does choose to make the Invicta Tactical Warsuit less relevant, they might have a very underpowered army overall. In general, before you go too down the level of spam, I'd be a bit more tempted to get a fair few choices from different areas of the codex, small amounts of a whole bunch of unit classes, where if Games Workshop do shift things around and something else becomes the best way to play your army, you're going to at least have a fair few things that are very relevant. You could also apply the same sort of thing to slightly more peripheral but powerful rules as well, things that are strong enough to build an army around. Say, for example, Raven Guard deep striking Centurions. You could kind of tell that was always going to be a gimmick, as it's not exactly very fluffy for them. If you collected a Raven Guard army that was very reliant on Centurions to do any damage, again, when the deep strike mechanic goes away for them, and the points might change, there's just a good chance your collection isn't going to be quite as strong in the future. There's perhaps a danger of that with allied rules as well. Games Workshop does shift up the way that armies can ally to each other quite a bit, so going down an absolute maximal route on taking allies for certain factions again might be a little bit counterproductive. And same for units that are equipped with weapons that don't really come in any one specific Games Workshop plastic kit. A lot of those options have been phased out with the jump into 10th edition, but in general you're going to be more safe with more recent Games Workshop plastics as opposed to things they might phase out or phase out the rules for. Finally, and also on the theme of talking about collecting for gaming, another often repeated bit of advice is that you probably don't want to be chasing the meta too much, maybe in a similar sort of example to the Invicta Tactical Warsuits in the previous slide. Even if you do really enjoy tournament and competitive gaming, you should really go into things expecting that unit power and army power can and will change over time. Different units will tend to get better and worse for each faction, occasionally being very powerful, occasionally being kind of useless. And the same unfortunately does seem to happen for entire armies, much to the annoyance of people collecting them. Most armies do tend to cycle around and have their time on top in each edition, it would seem recently, but there's every chance that an army could be very underpowered for a fairly significant period of time if Games Workshop doesn't get its act together with balance updates fast enough. When that comes to collecting, it probably means that it's not just worth painting up a whole bunch of models and units that you absolutely hate just because they're good in the game. Probably the worst thing to do would be to collect an army that you're really not invested in any way whatsoever, buy it up just literally for strong rules and put it on the table, and then go on to be incredibly surprised when the overpowered army inevitably gets nerfed by Games Workshop, as the way that they do things that's kind of expected right from the start. I think for people who are collecting for use in game, most people tend to have at least some sort of a balance when they're doing this, both collecting units they think fit in thematically with their force, but also some nods to effectiveness on the tabletop, and just in general tending to go at a slow, measured and sustainable pace, picking up a new unit, painting it up, and then enjoying some games with it. Maybe it might be something that is very powerful at the moment, maybe not, but then if you get that unit together and paint it up nicely, it'll always be an option in the future where things cycle around again. And certainly if you're planning to be in Warhammer for the long term, it means that establishing a robust collection of miniatures generally means that you'll have something fairly strong to put on the table, even if Games Workshop shifts things about. And it can be quite fun when one of your old units that's never been particularly strong suddenly gets to be the new meta hotness. For collecting with expected rules changes, it can be helped with with an emphasis of using core choices for your army, things that are kind of iconic, like say Guard Leman Russ battle tanks, or Drukhari Raiders and Venoms, things that, if they're very underpowered in game, generally going to give Games Workshop some criticism, and even if they do get kind of bad for a while, then they've got a far more likely chance than most to actually make them somewhat effective again, just because these are the units that people most want to see work well in game. You can also make things a bit more robust to addition and rules changes by magnetizing, and if you really wanted to run the absolute best stuff, maybe thinking about working with other people and sharing or lending stuff when you go out to tournaments. If you've got a few players that collect the same faction, you could produce a very, very scary list between the lot of you without all of you having to own the same thing. Obviously, some people have got plenty of disposable income to burn, plus are very interested in having the absolute top tier tournament stuff all the time. If that's the primary thing that you're getting out of the hobby, then it's not the worst thing in the world. I just bear in mind that it's usually going to be at least fairly expensive to be keeping on jumping from army to army like that. Models can resell quite well, but usually losing a bit of value at each trade. So anyway, let me know your thoughts as to a bunch of these potential mistakes when collecting Warhammer 40k. Do any of these particularly resonate with you? I know that I've certainly done a fair whack of these while building up collections myself. If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, or you'd just like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.